Good evening, everyone. Welcome to DLA Piper. My name is Ishbel McPherson and I'm a legal director in DLA Piper's Intellectual Property and Technology Group, and I'm normally based in Edinburgh, but I popped down specially for this event because it looked so interesting that I couldn't miss it. I have to offer our apologies from our Global Head of Life Sciences, who also was keen to attend this event, but she is stuck in Aruba and can't get back. DLA Piper is delighted to be hosting Women in Telecoms and Technologies panel discussion on trends in Medtech this evening. It's a very exciting place at the moment with new developments, wound care, robotics, biotechnology, AI, diagnostics, 3D printing, just to name only a few of the very exciting technologies that are in development at the moment. At DLA Piper, our life sciences and our technology sector teams are working very closely together to address the needs of medtech companies and their customers to navigate that very complex interaction of IP, regulatory, commercial, all of these difficult issues, of which GDPR has only been the latest in a long series. And then, of course, you have to fit into the ethics and research frameworks, which are also difficult to navigate on occasion. We're very much looking forward to hearing from the expert panel that Women in Telecoms and Technology have assembled for you tonight, and we are excited to have them here. Some of you may already know Annette Nabavi, who is our Women in Technology and Telecoms Director and Board Director at Maintel. And so I'm now going to hand over to her to introduce the panel and the event tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for... It's not on, that's why. Does that help? Good. Yes, it does help to turn these things on. We're only women in tech after all. So, I'm a lawyer. Exactly. So as Ishbel mentioned, my name is Annette Nabavi. I'm one of the directors here at Women in Telecoms and Technology. I also do a number of other things. I have a portfolio career. We have two of our other board directors here tonight, Audrey Mandela, who's our chair, and Yasmin Rajid, who's a board director as well. So if you've got any queries about WiTT, we're available for you. And we'll tell you a little bit at the end about our next meetings. So I just want to do the briefest of introductions of our speakers so that we can get on with this, because the programme is to have the four speakers speak for about 10 minutes or so each, and then go into a Q&A with the objective of finishing somewhere between 8 and 8:15 so that everybody can get home before the snow takes too much hold. So speakers tonight are Karen Taylor, who's the director at Deloitte's UK Centre for Health Solutions, and she's going to start the ball rolling. We've then got Pam Garside, who's a partner at Newhealth and a fellow at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. Have you got them the wrong way around? Well done, ladies. Rayna Patel will then pick up with her startup, which is called Vine Health. She'll tell you all about that. And then Hélène Viatge, voilà, who's the CEO of Bioinduction, will be telling us about that. Two very different companies, which I think will give us a really good insight into this whole thing. So, Karen, I'm going to just hand over to you to take us through what Deloitte has been doing in the research side of this.
And it's the down arrow, yeah?
It's the down arrow.
Good evening, everybody. It's my first time at one of these events here, the Women in Tech, and I'm not really in tech. I'm an accountant by profession. I have to apologise for that. I've never actually done any accounting, but that's what I studied and qualified as. And I run a small research hub in Deloitte called the Centre for Health Solutions, and our remit is to look at some of those challenges facing our clients in healthcare and life sciences, and to try and identify some solutions through rigorous research. We're independent, we don't do client-facing work, and our reports are left to us to determine what should be in the content.
I do look to see if there are any good practice examples that Deloitte have developed with clients, because if they have, then I'm sure they're going to be really good. And we do like to promulgate best practice, because I think that's how people learn. So I'm going to talk to you today about this report we published last year called Medtech and the Internet of Medical Things. We wanted to have a look at what Medtech was doing and the challenges they were facing in the space of healthcare. And of course, if it wasn't for healthcare providers, then there wouldn't be Medtech, because that's who they feed all their products into. That's who are their purchasers of the technology that they're developing. We specifically focused on connected medical devices. The technology today could mean that any single Medtech device, whether it's a scalpel or a MRI CT scan, can be connected, can collect data on the performance of the product itself, or can collect data on how patients are responding as a result of that technology being linked to a patient. So that, together with the increased connectivity, is leading to the Internet of Medical Things. So I'll just give you some highlights from the report. So what do we mean when we talk about the Internet of Medical Things? And I'm going to have to put my glasses on because I can't see very well without them. It's linking all of the different stakeholders in what is this Internet of Medical Things ecosystem. It's the medical device providers, of course, but also it's the systems and software providers who allow their devices that are connected to operate as they are intended, the system integrators, the original equipment manufacturers, the connectivity providers, and of course the end users. And all of those together form the Internet of Medical Things in our definition. And some of the multiple benefits that we are already seeing them deliver: decreased costs, improved diagnosis, improved disease management. And you'll hear about some of the initiatives from some of our other companies where whether they think it's part of the Internet of Medical Things or not, it could soon be, and some of them probably already are. Enhanced patient experience, really important, but in improved drug management, drug adherence, which is very critical for healthcare outcomes, and right at the centre, of course, is the patient and improved health outcomes. It connects secondary and primary care. It connects patients to other providers, whether they're within the health system or on the periphery, if they're startups, if they're other stakeholders, and of course the payers. You've got to think about who's paying for all of this technology. And then the life science companies, who can also benefit a lot from being connected through the Internet of Medical Things to the technology and to the data that is being generated. And there in that centre you've got telemedicine and smart pill bottles and genomics data and smart beds, huge proliferation in providers of data and which can be turned into insights and intelligence. Our report identified 8 key challenges and opportunities facing Medtech. So the key challenges that they have to understand and if they're going to operate effectively in the digital healthcare world is, first of all, they have to understand the end users. If they're developing technology, if they're adding connectivity to an existing product without consulting the end user of whether it's something they need to solve a problem or whether it's something they would be interested in acquiring, they're not going to buy it. And why would they pay extra for something if it's not something they need? So understanding the end user and the end user understanding how the medtech company can help them improve their productivity, their understanding of the patient, those are the things that the conversations that really need to happen, that traditionally didn't happen because the medtech company produced a product. Yes, they often helped healthcare providers to understand how to implement that product, how to use the product, but that was the job done. Now there is much more of a service type environment being created. In order to move into this world where medtech companies can be more of a service provider than just a product provider, you need to develop new funding and business operating models. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges facing medtech companies. We did a survey of medtech companies, and it's the area where they were having the biggest struggle, developing those business and operating models that enabled them to differentiate their products from the service, and also to convince their funders that it was the way to the direction of travel. Interoperability. In healthcare, it's a big challenge regardless of whether we're involving the the medtech or pharma companies, but for medtech, interoperability is arguably their biggest challenge. Unless the devices they're developing can interconnect with the electronic patient records, whether the data can be fed in to the system, that is either the biggest barrier, or potentially they can help solve it to become the biggest enabler of this future. Maintaining cybersecurity, as soon as you start collecting data, as soon as your product is doing more than just being a static product, you're generating data, then there is the risk of cyber. What we asked questions about cybersecurity, we were very surprised about how optimistic our medtech companies, and they ranged from predominantly small, medium enterprises, but some of the very big medtech companies also. There's a big range of respondents to our survey. They all were very optimistic about their cyber preparedness for cyber, and felt that they had the right skills and talent, and they had the right processes and systems in place. But when you ask what they were actually doing, it was because they had managed to not get attacked by the WannaCry, or because their product, they'd seen some attempts being repelled. But I would say to them, and we do say in the report, you cannot rest on cyber. You design that security in right from the outset. And often they were patches at the end, being put on when something was alerted to them. Regulatory change for medtech, there are big regulatory changes. We've already heard the GDPR mentioned. That has proven very difficult for some of our companies. But also we've got the medical device regulations and the in vitro device regulations coming on stream in the next couple of years. And preparedness for them, again, our companies were relatively optimistic how well prepared they were. But when I talk to my colleagues who are asked to come in and do a health check, they find that they're very optimistic. The national picture is a line here. The reality when you do a check is down here somewhere, and their own view is that it's over here somewhere. So I think there is a lot to be done to prepare medtech companies for those new regulations. And of course there is other regulations. They're not the only ones. It's a very heavily regulated industry. Attracting digital talent and building digital capability was another challenge. As we move into this data environment, what you need are new types of staff. You need the data scientists. You need technologists that are not your engineers that you've been used to employing. And lots of other industries are also fishing in that same pond for those same talents. So there is a need to think about how you grow your own talents, but also how you partner with others to enable you to have the talent that you need to move into the future of a digital healthcare world. Maintaining trust in a digital age. Medtech companies are generally quite well trusted by patients. If you survey patient groups, they come out reasonably well, certainly a lot better than pharma. But as they start to have access to and make use of patient data, and as they start to sell services rather than products, there is a risk of them losing the trust of the patients. So maintaining that trust is a really important challenge that they need to address. And then finally, loads and loads of good technology, and you're going to hear about some of those, but adoption at scale is the real challenge within the healthcare system. Often they're used and work well in sometimes even one ward in a hospital, and are not even adopted in the next door ward. Between hospitals, getting adoption is a challenge. There's lots of things happening today to try and improve that, but still, adoption at scale is one of the biggest issues for healthcare. I'm very optimistic that some of the initiatives in the long-term plan, the NHS long-term plan, will encourage a wider adoption at scale, and will also make it easier for medtech companies to work with healthcare providers. So, just to sum up, medtech is transforming from an innovative product supplier to an insightful partner in healthcare. And some of the solutions that we identify with some good practice case examples of where it's already happening are in the collaboration between healthcare providers and medtech. And 87% of respondents agreed that realising the benefits and delivering value and efficiency will only be delivered through collaboration. Digitally connected devices that benefit patients and hospitals. The patients here do stand to benefit enormously from some of the innovations that we're seeing. Joining the dots between connected medical devices and healthcare IoT, that interoperability challenge. Advanced analytics, if you're going to have all this data, you've got to turn it into intelligence. and insights. And so the application of analytics is critical, and then transforming the business models. That's all I want to say. It's a big report, and I've covered it in a short time, but hopefully it's given you a flavour of it, and really look forward to answering any questions you have. Thank you.
I just go.
I think you just...
Yeah, that's it.
You're there? Great.
Great.
So,
So how many of you work in health or even, what do you do?
We assess apps for the NHS and then help GPs to recommend them directly to patients.
And are you in a private company doing
Yes.
that? Yeah. Which company?
Our mobile health.
Oh, okay, great. And other people? Oh, I know Loy, I know you. Yeah. So what do you do?
We carry out research amongst patient groups worldwide into their perspectives on healthcare, and one tranche is digital health, and what they want from digital
Okay.
health and often aren't finding.
Good. Anyone else? Sort of? Not a lot. Okay. Yeah, you do. Do you?
Medical engineer.
Oh, right. Great. So I'm a bit weird. I am actually an angel investor. I started off life as a hospital manager. I didn't do that for long. I worked in America for 10 years. And I got into... So all I know is healthcare. That's all I know. And it's a very interesting definitional area. So Karen's talking about Medtech and digital health. I'll go into that a little. And I'm now... I'm an advisor, sort of management advisor. I help some companies coming into this country to understand the health system. I am an angel investor, and then I teach at Cambridge in the business school on the MBA, and I sit on the investment committee for the university's tech transfer company, investing across all sectors, but I tend to be there, representing health. And then I mentor a lot of young people, and I may be proud enough to say Rayna's one of mine. So you'll hear her later. And a lot of my young people, like Rayna, are clinicians, doctors leaving clinical medicine, some of them having a big crisis, like, I can't do medicine anymore, and a lot of them coming into this area. So I'm a big evangelist, and my job here is to convince you how exciting healthcare is as a sector. So in Cambridge, I one of my colleagues here, I'm in Cambridge Angels, which is a very old established, distinguished angel investing group. And traditional Cambridge investment sectors are, life sciences and biotech, and then hard, deep tech, software, AI, lots of blokey things, big techie things. You'll understand as an engineer. And then, and mine is this sort of health tech, digital health, healthcare services. And a lot of people call me life sciences. And I go, no, I'm not life sciences. To me, that's sort of pharma and biotech. And I'm much more on the healthcare delivery and digitally enabled tech, tech-enabled stuff. The Americans call it different things as well. And then in the middle of all this, that pink blob is data, and that's the future, and that's where a lot of activity is. And Karen referred a bit to this. So we have so much more data. And that's why we can use AI. Every business plan I see, actually it's got a bit better, says they do AI, and you go, yeah, whatever. And they don't really. Some of them do. And then they say they do blockchain, and I go, woo. I actually understand blockchain, but I don't see how it's going to apply quite yet. But the data thing, that pink blob is very important. And the money is in that bottom left-hand corner. The life sciences and pharma companies still make a lot of money, and they, I hope personally, will be buying some of these smaller companies coming along. Karen mentioned the difficulty of adoption at scale, particularly in the NHS. It is a long, long slog. You can do it, but two of my companies, I only invest small amounts of money, not massive, and I have like 13 companies, but two of them have just given up on the NHS. It's a bit sad. And they've switched or pivoted, and they're going to be, they're working with real-world evidence, clinical research organisations, and the life science pharma sector. So data, woo, lots of it. And it's going to embrace all of this. And I'm just going to go through a bit of what you will see as consumers as well. So actually, this is what as investors, what we look for, just briefly, is the founders, people like Rayna, and the management team, the technology. Can you defend the IP? Is it a big enough market? Can you scale it? Which Karen mentioned, the model, obviously, and then the basic financials. Now, again, at my stage of investing, the financial chart always goes like that. So this is all the money we're going to make. And of course, you can't really challenge it because they don't have any track record. When you get to the venture capital stage, of course, there's a much more defensible track record of what they're actually going to make. So I'm not going to go through that. So why health is big? So this is MIT, probably, I think, the best university in the world with the best technology transfer office. Cambridge has a good one. But, you know, $2 million to save this child's life. Last week, is the NHS going to take payment for you to have your baby's genome profiled? This morning in the news, the first CAR T trial, did you read that, of a boy with leukemia in Great Ormond Street? £300,000 for that technology. And if you go to the American health system now, they talk about it, but they don't know, and neither does the NHS know, how they're going to pay for this. It's extraordinary development in genomics and cancer and personalised medicine. And it's a real conundrum. It's a big challenge because the big insurers can't afford it. The Uniteds and the Kaisers and the Humanas, the people you may have heard of in America. And I don't know how we're going to resolve this except by rationing, because few people will be able to afford this, and it's massive. And you will hear a lot more about this. Those of us in the industry have heard about CAR T for years, and it was great that we heard about it today, but then there's the price tag. So the brain, we're about to hear about that, AI, all the neurological developments that are happening, wearable tech and smart medical devices, which some of you will be wearing. Is anybody wearing? I'm not wearing one. Are you wearing? Anybody wearing a Fitbit or anything? Yeah, those things. There's a lot of this stuff. I don't know enough about it to differentiate who's good or not. But again, they're all channeling and streaming data into somewhere. Obviously, the companies are collecting it, but the bigger companies are also very interested. You know more than me, colleague over there, about apps. There are hundreds of thousands of apps. Apple does a reasonable job of curating them. I'm sure for the NHS you're doing a good job. You know, there's an app for the best excuse for pulling a sickie at work. You know, that's counted as a health app. It's just a massive field, you know, and there's hundreds a day being developed. Apple is very interesting to watch. Apple's just announced a deal with Johnson & Johnson on heart rate monitoring, and it's getting more and more serious. So Apple and Google ventured into health about 8 or 9 years ago, thinking, it's a big industry, we'll get into that. And neither of them did very well. And they didn't understand it. It's a terribly complex industry. The most important player, I hate to say this, are the doctors. They're much more powerful than they say. They all say, oh, we're losing our power. They're not really. In America, they're particularly important, and they drive the revenue sort of cycles, as it were. It's a complex industry, but they're back. They are back with massive investments in health. So Apple's watch, we were all waiting to hear what the watch would have on it, and it was a bit of a damp squib at first, but they will clearly do more and more. And they know there's glucose monitoring and all sorts of things, but they're particularly interested in the heart at the moment. There's the Internet of Things. This is very old school Internet of Things, but you know, there's Alexa's going to get into this, obviously. Alexa's going to control our lives, but this is the Fitbit and the device on your desk and the device by your bed and your phone. But this has got more sophisticated since this photo was taken. So I've mentioned the big guys and the FANGs, etc. Telefonica is doing a big piece of research because its cash cow has been the phone, and it now realizes, you know, WhatsApp, etc., instant messaging is taking over, and they're investing a lot looking at mental health. Samsung, huge investments in health that we will see a lot more come out of. But the big one is Amazon. Now, my students, I say to them, because my students are probably a third from the health industry, maybe a bit less, a third vaguely health, and a third never seen it before. And I say, don't think that hospitals and insurance companies and governments are are going to hire you. The big tech companies will hire you. And I used to say, I say it openly now, Amazon's going to come into health, and they're here, they're doing it. They bought PillPack in America for inflated price, and they're in several states, more than 10 states now, with buying up pharmacy chains. I can't say what they're doing here, but I know they're doing things. And they have our data. It's not just Amazon Web Services, which the government's obviously contracting with, but they are, I think, the most interesting company in health. And I believe my MBAs, my youngsters, will go and work with them. And I wish I were younger. Now I'd go and work with them. So, and you know, they have all the fulfillment centres, if you're thinking about boring things like procurement. But I think it will be much more personalisation of our daily lifestyles, which will go over into medicine and medtech and health. So that was for me. And then I have, this is the NHS, you know, spent $7 billion on a computer system. And I thought this was good for a women in tech audience. So the NHS, which is very close to my heart because I lived in America for 10 years, which is a terrible health system. Sorry if there's any Americans here. It can't seem to adopt things right. And then, this is just one of my favourites from Kalman about, you know, we try and do everything for the patient, but the hospital died. So, yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Let me leave that up there. Sorry, that's right. Sort out the slides briefly. We're just about to have Rayna come and talk to us about Vine Health. While I'm doing this, let me just tell you that she has just won the most innovative health startup 2019 at Deloitte Award. So congratulations to her.
I hadn't met her before I voted for her, just so you know.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Away you go.
Great. So you've heard about the top-down overview of health, so I'm going to go to the really granular level and just talk about what I'm doing. So we have co-founded a company called Vine Health, which is using behavioural science and artificial intelligence to improve survival of cancer patients. And I'll go into a bit more detail about exactly what we do in a moment, but for now I just thought I'd touch briefly on our backgrounds. We're a very rare sort of double female co-founder team, which you don't see very often in tech. I'm a medical doctor, as Annette mentioned, and I've spent the last 10 years in frontline hospitals with patients, but also in clinical trial research on looking at drugs and also in government policy. And my co-founder, another very unusual entity, which is a female data scientist and machine learning expert, and she spent her career at McLaren Applied Technologies building health tech, and also at Touch Surgery, which builds VR tech for surgeons. I thought I'd just give a brief overview of what the landscape is like in startups and VC, because I think it's important. It's not actually obvious until you get there, and why events like this are so important. So currently, the ratio of men to women entrepreneurs in England is 2 to 1, but the amount of VC funding that goes to female founders is only 12%. And when you get to female CEOs, it's 2.7%. And when you get to all-female teams, like Georgie and I, it's 2%. And actually, I think for women of ethnic minorities, that goes down to 0.2. So it's really dramatic difference, and it's just an indication of the opportunity that's out there for women in tech today. So it's pretty shocking. To go into what we do and to give some context to that, we focus on cancer. And why that's so important now? Well, global cancer rates are expected to rise by 70% between now and 2040, which is huge. And what that means for those of us in this room who live in the UK is that 1 in 2 of us will get cancer. And that's pretty shocking in itself. But what lots of people, and doctors included, don't know is that the way a patient behaves in their everyday life, so how they take their medications, how much exercise they do, how stressed they are, those things account for 60% of their outcomes. So those behaviours essentially decide how long they'll live. And why is that important? Well, currently 70% of cancer drugs are taken incorrectly. And we've talked about the bigger picture of, you know, constrained health resources, doctors not having enough time, technology enabling that. Well, as patients get less and less time with their doctor, the capacity for error and the information that you get from your health service may well decrease because the ratio of how much time you get with your health service is going down. And what can we do about that? Well, the evidence quite optimistically shows that just tracking your symptoms effectively, for example through technology, can increase your survival by up to 5 months, or there are other papers saying by up to 20%. So simply having a better overview of your health and therefore feeling more in control can actively increase your survival. And that's good news for people who wear Fitbits, but it's also good news for cancer patients who might be able to better track their health and understand what's going on. So this is, in summary, the problem, that patients actually often aren't empowered or given the tools to have control of their healthcare or understand how to best look after their own health. And I know personally that, and particularly as cancer becomes a chronic condition, as most of the diseases are that are going to cripple our society over the next few decades, so for example, 58% of cancer patients have cancer for 10 years or more. It's really becoming a chronic disease, much like diabetes or heart disease, heart failure. And the health service simply doesn't have the capacity to follow up all those patients for 10 years face to face. So you need better ways of understanding what patients are doing remotely, both so that they don't have the inconvenience of having to visit you for every appointment, but also so that you get an idea of what's going on in the 99% of the time that they're not with you. And that's a problem not just for the NHS, but for hospitals everywhere. So what we're doing at Vine Health, hopefully, is trying to solve that problem. So we use this combination of behavioural science, which looks at how humans make decisions, what are the flaws in how we behave, and those are reflected in things like why we smoke, even though it's not good for us, why we overeat, even though we know we shouldn't. And it takes those flaws and changes aspects of your environment to change the decisions that you're making about your health. And we combine that with artificial intelligence, so we can use algorithms to tell you what would work best for you in a given situation. So we do that in 2 ways. Firstly, through our mobile platform, which allows patients to collect and track and visualise their own health data, and that includes medications, symptoms, side effects, what their doctor's saying, how they're behaving in their own lifestyle, so what they're eating and how much exercise they do. And that's incidentally something that cancer patients are already doing. They're already tracking these things in large part and trying to visually understand when can I fit in going to work? Can I fit that in? When can I fit in exercise? Am I going to feel too tired 3 days after chemo? Am I going to need someone to come and help me with my meals for that day? So we put all that into technology and we apply machine learning to it. So we detect patterns and triggers in the data to say, this side effect of your chemotherapy might be related to this drug, and flag that. Or this point during chemotherapy is when you might feel most tired, and this is when you might need support. And then we deliver personalised interventions to the patient to nudge behaviour change and increase survival. And then on the other side of things, we allow clinical teams to visualise from afar what their patient's doing and what they're struggling with and how to manage them better. So we're just building a digital way to really scalably improve that cancer management process from both ends. And this is Beth. Beth is one of our users. She is actually a US-based cancer patient, and she's been through breast cancer multiple times. She's been through multiple rounds of chemotherapy, and like most cancer patients, she's avidly tracking every aspect of her care. But you can imagine it's really difficult for her to say, I think this one of my 13 drugs is responsible for my rash, or I'm going to tell work I can't go in for this week, but actually not know how long that's going to last. And we take all her data and we track it and we answer those questions. And we also deliver these small behavioural nudges. So, for example, understanding for Beth that if she fits in 5 minutes of exercise 4 days per week, her experience of fatigue from her chemotherapy drugs is reduced by 20%. And that's actually really counterintuitive, because for lots of people it's, I feel really tired, I don't feel able to do exercise. And it takes knowing that for your personal data, doing that little bit of exercise would actually reduce your level of fatigue. And knowing that for yourself is a really important motivator for being able to actually do it. And the really important thing here is that these side effects, it's really easy to brush off fatigue as a minor thing, but actually what limits the amount of chemotherapy that most chemo patients can be prescribed is actually whether they can tolerate it and whether they can tolerate those side effects. I'll brush over this, but broadly we're partnering with various NHS organisations and various charities to reach these patients at scale, and also through social media and various other means. And this all ties in with the priorities in the UK as a whole. So the government has just released the NHS long-term plan, which echoes some of the things said in the 5-year forward view, which is that to solve this problem of there isn't enough money in healthcare, and there never will be because of the expensive things, we need to empower patients to take control of their own care. and this is just how we're growing. I'll skip over that. And this is our team. So I've gone over Georgie and I's background. We are advised by various oncology professors. Liz O'Riordan, who if you ever get to hear her speak or follow her on social media, she's a really respected breast cancer surgeon, but she's also an advanced breast cancer patient, and she's absolutely fascinating to listen to her experiences from both sides of that fence. Owen Service, who ran the Cabinet Office's Nudge Unit, again a really interesting organisation. They use behavioural science to affect public behaviour, which sounds like a really ominous thing to do, but it's broadly to help people pay their taxes on time and not get a fine, or go to school, or look after their own health. So really what we want to do is empower people living with cancer to have control over their own care. And if you speak to people with cancer, often what they say is, particularly those who are living with 10 years for 10 years or more, they want to know that they're able to live a normal life. They're able to live the same life that they would if they weren't on all these horrible chemo drugs that really affect their lifestyle. And just to give a broader perspective of what we're trying to do here, we've talked a little bit about life sciences industries and how all the money is there. And it's an interesting point that actually the drugs that they're developing, they develop through clinical trials where they get data about how patients respond to these drugs. And in cancer, only 4% of cancer patients will ever be involved in a clinical trial. And that means those drugs are generally, and actually this is very relevant to this audience, because for those clinical trials you often have inclusion criteria. For example, for this drug we will have men aged 21 to 50 who have no other diseases, who are based in a certain geographical location, and those will be the patients for that trial. And it generally is men aged 21 to 50. So these drugs aren't being developed for the whole population, they're being developed for the 4%. And if we can get this data through our technology about how patients are behaving in the real world, and it ties into the real world evidence that we hope will enable, a broader perspective on healthcare, we hope that we can make that drug development much faster, and we can also make it apply to the whole population and not just that tiny percentage. So we're partnering with a few charities across the UK, and if anyone belongs to any charities or any hospitals, would love to talk to you. And that's a brief overview of what we're doing. Thank you.
Super. So over to you, Hélène. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Hélène and I'm the CEO of Bioinduction. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is just a little bit about what we are doing with Bioinduction and with the deep brain stimulation and what it is. And then I'll just quickly conclude on some of the Medtech industry challenges and my perspective and my experience in Medtech. So in addition to what you've been told tonight, you have also 50% of chance to develop one of these conditions. So that's a really positive evening. So yeah, stroke, hypertension, or dementia are actually a big deal. But no, there is a positive note. We are all gonna solve it. And so all those cerebrovascular conditions are actually highly linked to a reduced blood flow to the brain. And they are one of the greatest remaining healthcare challenges faced by humanity, and Bioinduction is basically trying to revolutionize the treatment of this condition. There are more than 100 million people all over the world affected by these conditions, and this is constantly growing with the aging population. And currently, there are no efficient drugs or treatment to address or even modify the course of this treatment. Wired Health phrase it like this: the future of medication isn't into drugs and their countless side effects, as it's been mentioned as well. Like, the drugs are actually indeed developed with some clinical trials, very targeted, and they actually often have quite limited impacts and on a specific population. And we think that the future of medication is in electrical implants. And even the pharma industry is currently going into this direction. So GSK has recently done a joint venture with Google to invest heavily into bioelectronics. And Abbott, which is a big pharma group, has acquired recently St. Jude Medical, which is a medical device group, for $25 billion. And the fifth of St. Jude Medical revenues is around deep brain stimulation. So just to explain. So what is deep brain stimulation? The video didn't work, so I'm just going to show you very quickly. So deep brain stimulation is the stimulation of the brain, basically. And it's been used already for Parkinson treatment for more than 15 years, so quite a long time now. And just to show you quickly the impact, when you've got Parkinson, you've got lots of tremor, obviously. And so this patient has an implant in the brain, and he has deactivated it just for the purpose of this video, and he's gonna try to catch his device to activate it again, just to show you the impact. He's just gonna, so the IPG is implanted in the chest, and he will just put it there, activate it again, and the tremor completely stop. And then, I mean, he's exhausted because obviously this is quite tiring, but then you can see he's now able to do quite accurate gestures, so they learn to do that. So that's just like fascinating, really. So that's deep brain stimulation. I'm just gonna stop the video and go back there. So the concept is you have a lead inserted into the brain, and it's connected to a pulse generator that is currently this size, approximately. And this is, because it's big, it's implanted in the chest, and then there is a extension lead to connect this to the brain lead. And so the extension leads go through all your neck, which is quite a long and painful process. So the surgery takes 6 hours approx, and sometimes it's also done in 2 days, and it's quite long and complex. So what are we doing with bioinduction? 2 things. So first, we've conducted more than 10 years of clinical research with our clinical director called Patel, a neurosurgeon. And what we've discovered is, first, all the cerebrovascular conditions I've mentioned, stroke, hypertension, and dementia, are all linked to this reduction in the blood flow in the brain. And also, we've identified and patented a brain target, so an area in the brain, that when you stimulate with a specific pattern in terms of amplitude and width and frequency, will basically bring back the blood flow to the brain. We have so far 5 patients that have been implanted with deep brain stimulation on this specific area of the brain. So it's a different area than the Parkinson one. And those patients all had high blood pressure, multiple strokes. Since the implantation, no more stroke, and they have gone back to a normal blood pressure. So this is quite exciting. For some of them, it's more than 10 years of no more stroke. So in layman term, what we've done is we've find a way to bring back the blood flow to the brain and resetting the brain using deep brain stimulation. However, as I've mentioned, the surgery for deep brain stimulation is currently very complex. So to be really able to address the huge market of deep brain stimulation, what we've done in addition is we've developed Pico Sim, which is this device, which is a third of the devices of the competitors. And because it's really small, we are able to implant it in the skull directly, like a cochlear implant, and cutting the surgery time by 2. So we are making the surgery much simpler and much shorter. And we are also trying to work with lots of robotics company to also automatize the surgery and itself, to cut it down and make deep brain stimulation as mainstream as a cardiac pacemaker implantation. So I don't know if you are familiar with that, but to put a pacemaker today, it's 30 minutes, and it's a local anesthesia. It's really simple. I mean, it's also going into the heart, so you could think it will be much longer and much more complex. But now, cardiac pacemaker implantations are actually really mainstream, and so what we want to do is do the same thing for the deep brain stimulation. So yes, that's quite exciting. And so yeah, I think it's my last slide on the bioinduction, but we've been on for more than 10 years and we've only raised 5 million so far. We have partly acquired the only approved manufacturer for active implantable medical device in the UK. So being approved by BSI, or a notified body to manufacture active implantable medical device, is quite a challenge. We have 12 patents, and we have done some clinical evidence with pilot study with those 5 patients. We are actually starting to another clinical trial on Parkinson, just to prove that our device is safe, and then starting another trial on hypertension and stroke, hopefully next year. And yes, that's where we are really, and we are currently going for another round of investments. So just a little bit about my experience in the medtech industry. Before Bioinduction, I was in another medtech company called Cupris making a medical device class 1, which was much simpler. So yeah, just one of the main challenges, and it's been mentioned, is regulation. So there is classification in medical device. You've got class 1, 2A, 2B, 3. And active implantable medical device, which is the worst. Which makes sense, but it is quite complex. And depending on your class, you will have to prove that your device is safe for the patient. So you'll have to go through significant V&V, which is verification and validation of all your processes and manufacturing and design. So for the engineers in the room, my background is engineering, so you do some mechanical testing, so it's like push test, drop test, just to prove that your device will actually result any shocks, and then electrical testing, and then EMC means electromagnetical compatibility, ETC is for the radio communication. Environmental testing, packaging testing is basically you have to prove that it resists vibrations or different temperature ranges, because when you ship your device, you have to prove that it won't affect the quality of your device. For our device, biocompatibility and sterilization is obviously quite important, and it's hard and long to do those testing, and not really, it's really expensive and complex. Usability testing is more about like how are the surgeons and the patient gonna use it, and is it actually intuitive enough in a way. If you have software involved, and that's the case on our device, you have to validate it. It's called black box testing or white box testing, but basically you have to go through all the different use cases and try to make it bug. And then manufacturing requirements are also quite heavy in terms of the components you purchase to manufacture your device. You need to be able to trace them from the supplier to the finished product, and to keep on this traceability for years and years. So that's quite a heavy challenge, I would say, for the medtech industry. Depends on your product again, but the second big challenge is collecting clinical evidence. It's been mentioned as well, but there is a new harmonized regulation coming in 2020 called the Medical Device Regulation, MDR, and it is a change, so it is quite complex as well. Not to mention that our notified bodies, so BSI, were UK-based, and with the Brexit, they are starting to panic because they cannot see any good outcomes. So basically, they have created another office in the Netherlands, and they are trying to move their certification. But basically, for all the medical device manufacturers, it is quite complex to manage this change. And so the MDR is mainly stressing more than before on all the clinical evidence that you need to gather to prove that your device is actually better than the existing devices on the market. So you have to conduct clinical trials, but also literature review, check that there hasn't been any adverse events reported with the competitor devices, so it's quite wide. And clinical trials are extremely complex to set up, long and expensive. So that's another challenge, because you do need to have quite a bit of funding upfront to prove that your device actually works. And the third one I would mention, and also this has been mentioned as well, scalability. It's clearly not as straightforward as in other industry. I had only thought about country already, but I mean, you've mentioned in the UK already, from one hospital to the other, it's complex. But even if you got the UK market, scaling to other European country or the US or other countries is actually really difficult for mainly two reasons. One is the regulation. So in the past, CE marking or FDA approval were enough for lots of countries, but now more and more countries are asking for additional submissions. So you need to submit a specific application, and they have some additional requirements and translations and so on. And then the distribution, the medical field is still really highly dependent on congresses, publication, key opinion leader, which is quite specific to the medical field, I think. So just to finish on a more positive note, this is a challenging environment, but it is I think, a very exciting field to work in. I mean, since I've left my engineering school 10 years ago. I mean, I've started in the medical world and I've never left it, because it is an industry where we've got so much more, like so many things to discover. We don't know yet the whole human body well enough. And there are so many very exciting technologies, as like what you are doing. I've listed a few of them, but like 3D printing is a very exciting field, I think. Open Bionics, which is a Bristol-based company, like us, they do 3D printed processes with Disney superpower, which is really cool. CellLink do 3D printing of human tissue. Also a very exciting field. There are more and more robotics, AR, VR, AI chatbots. All the telemedicine field is quite exciting. Big Vision is a very interesting company. I invite you to have a look. They do things around the health eye care in developing worlds. GTX Medical is a Swiss company who have developed a spinal cord stimulation device for paraplegic people, and they've recently made someone walk again, which was quite fascinating as well, and so on and so forth. So please do go into this industry if people are interested into going into the medtech. It is a fascinating industry to work in. And I think that's all. Yes, sorry, I have been told to mention that as well. I'm part of a network called One Health Tech, which is a network of women in health tech, and the aim is to support and promote diversity in this industry, because we are unfortunately underrepresented, as you mentioned. And it's a free network with conferences exactly like you are doing with women in telecom and technology. So I am part of the Bristol hub, but there is an hub in London, and they are doing lots of really interesting conferences. So I invite you to have a look as well.
Did Angela actually come?
I cannot see her.
No,
I don't.
Exactly. No,
She was supposed to come, but
yeah, she was supposed to be here, but obviously hasn't made it. But thank you for mentioning that, because otherwise I would have done it. Thank you very much. Now it's not quite 8 o'clock, so we do have some time for a few questions. I'm sure there are lots of questions, so let me open it to the floor. I've got some as well, if people have it. Yes?
We should use the mic
Oh, yes.
that's all right.
That would be great. Can you just say who you are?
Just press the button.
One on the bottom.
Hello?
Yeah. Yep, that works.
Hiya, I'm Corinne Fitzgerald. I'm a health researcher for Swiss Re. We're a reinsurance company. I look at mental health and mortality trends and stuff, so that's cool. I work less with people, more with information, so forgive me. I had questions for pretty much everybody, but I'll keep it. Rayna, if you don't mind, I'll ask you a few. So I was really interested in those nudges that you were talking about, and I wondered if you had the actual figures on how many people action the nudges that you send, especially if they're couched in terms about involving statistics and stuff. If people see a number like 20% over something, do they see that as negligible when it comes to themselves? And I wondered if you had information on the long-term adherence to your platform, and whether that was, if you were seeing long-term behavioural change over kind of short-term, highly incentivised behavioural change. And I wondered also about the partners that you mentioned. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's go with the first.
Yeah. Well,
so go with the nudges one first.
Yes. I mean, they're all great questions, and I know Swiss Re's been doing really good work in that area. So in terms of the nudges that we've been experimenting with, and we still are in that building phase where we're seeing which have the most effect, and they vary dramatically by when you deliver them, the very precise wording that you use. So if you make that language friendly, for example, versus if you give a formal medical wording of a sentence, even if there's no jargon in it, the compliance sort of doubles between one and the other. So the language has a huge effect. The time of day that you deliver it, so if you tell someone to do exercise at 2 p.m, they've got almost zero chance of doing it if you deliver that nudge at that point, because they've just had lunch and they're sleepy and they don't want to, like anyone wouldn't. Whereas if you give it at sort of at the point that they're waking up, or at the point where they're, you know, just before dinner and they feel like they've got 5 minutes until they'll eat, then compliance goes up hugely. And actually part of developing the machine learning aspect of the product is to determine on an individual basis what are those factors that make someone respond. So for one person it might be a totally different time of day, and one person might respond to totally different language, but you can, through machine learning, tailor that on an individual basis and therefore get much higher engagement rates than if you were delivering the same nudges to everybody. And that's something we're still working out. So we're in the very early stages of our company, and unfortunately because of that we can't give long-term data. But that's something that we want to test, and I've now sort of, so the negatives are clinical trials, but we do want to do clinical trials on our products so that we can establish what those long-term effects are.
Great.
It's something that we're in a very early stage of.
Fine. Corinne, we'll come back to you, but let me just let one or two other people have a go as well. But you've obviously got loads of questions, so don't worry, we'll come back to you. There were a couple of other hands I saw go up. At the back there? I can't see who you are.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm from Starling Bank, which is an app-only bank, so it's not to do with health, but very much to do with tech. It was also for Rayna. Just why cancer in particular, and was there more of a backstory as to why you chose that, or was it from those statistics that you showed of it's going to become even more of a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the broader point here is that we see this sort of technology applying to every chronic disease out there, and it's already being developed in lots of ways for diabetes in particular because there's an easy way of tracking it, but it equally applies to hypertension, heart disease, strokes, you know, every chronic disease out there. One reason why we started with cancer is because people who have cancer are highly motivated to look after their own health. You know, it's a life-limiting disease, and it has that kind of emotional connotation in a way that, say, heart failure doesn't, despite heart failure actually having a higher mortality than many cancers. And for that reason, people who are living with cancer are so highly motivated to understand their own condition. Often it's a very complex disease where you're on more than 10 medications, you have 5 different health professionals you're engaging with, and so the advice that you're being given from many different quarters is so complex, it's really difficult to understand whose advice to follow, how they all map to each other, and how to put them together. Whereas, for example, with diabetes or heart failure, you might be mostly managed by your GP and therefore have one source of medical input. And then part of it was just the growth in cancer. So it's going to become a much more common disease, and that's not just as a result of environmental factors like pollution, but because of the behaviours themselves. As the entire world shifts towards a Western diet and Western lifestyle, rates are going to dramatically rise.
Right, thank you. Question at the back there?
Hi, my name's Jenna. I work as a lawyer at White & Case, so I've got a sadly slightly legal question on this. But one thing that obviously people in various industries and technology are dealing with a lot at the moment is the issue of how do you protect data and people's privacy. And I think we're seeing a lot of privacy issues as well playing out just in media and forms of other networks, like social media is one which springs to mind. But how much of a barrier, maybe Karen and Rayna, you've probably both got different perspectives on this, but how much of a barrier is the data regulation to kind of the positive things that you're trying to achieve with machine learning, and also how much do people's individual privacy concerns, which are very valid, and I know personally I actually am quite wary of a lot of the sort of medtech, Internet of Medical Technology, because of the opacity of what's happening with the data you put into a Fitbit or the running shoes that have a nifty gadget in them to tell you how far you've gone. But how much is that perception around privacy concerns affecting take-up of the products that are being developed, either by individual patients but also by organisations like the NHS or somewhere else that are actually really risk averse around this because they see massive fines if something goes wrong?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So I'll answer from the perspective of the research that we've done, and including our ongoing research, which is specifically about shaping a digital future for healthcare. And one of the issues that crops up is that data privacy and data security. And there are a lot of myths around it, and so I think if you start to design your services around the patient and what the patients want, if somebody has got a life-limiting condition or a chronic disease, and if they are explained to them that sharing their data will help them understand their own illness better, will help their clinicians care for them better, and could also even help pharma companies develop a drug that might help them, because as you showed, there's a lot of areas that have not got any good treatments. Most patients will be prepared to share their data, but they want to decide who it's shared with and be in control of it. And that's why you see the development and the ambition actually in the 10-year plan, long-term plan, is that patients will ultimately own their own data and decide who to share it with. And there are already companies like Patients Know Best, whose platform is based on that, patients having control and sharing their own data. And we're seeing that happening more and more. There will always be a threat to data breaches, but how secure are all those paper records that are left on a bench or on a desk? You know, they've never been secure. Left in car boots, they've never been that secure. The difference is that there's masses of data together. You can lose a whole hospital's patient records in one go if it's hacked. So that's why it's important to have the security. But as for sharing the data and the use that data can be put to, I think we've heard proof of how the benefits so far outweigh the negatives, as long as we can put some security things in check.
Yeah. From an
it's
entrepreneur's point of view, or
well,
from
actually, it's
an
not
angel's
so
point
much
of
from
view.
that point of view, but it's a massive issue, absolutely massive. And the big illustrations in this country are Google bought DeepMind. DeepMind who does some great work at the Royal Free Hospital, Moorfield Hospital, and they messed up the decisions about the use of the data. And now I was with a government person, I'm not saying who said GDM. I said, what's GDM? He said Google DeepMind. You know, it's all now conflated into one thing. I was at a conference where, the people who are doing some really good work on this are the Oxford Internet Institute. So it's an ethical issue, it's a financial issue. John Bell at Oxford is quite rightly saying these data are of such value, the NHS can't just give it away to the commercial side. And I was at a conference, this is actually quite good, and we were all talking about this and saying we need regulatory frameworks nationally in each country. And this Chinese woman stood up and she said, well, you know, there are almost 1 billion smartphones in China and the government has all our data and we don't care. And that's so different from most, even developing countries. But I think we're at the very beginning. I think there will be a legal practice around this. There'll be government regulation. I think Karen's absolutely right. The more we say, you, Pam Garside, you hold your data, but we're not quite there yet, I don't think. Yeah.
I would agree with that. Yeah. There's a man with a microphone there, so I'm not going to be able to stop you. But be quick with your question.
Hi, my name is Lloyd, and I have a question for...
It was working just now.
It's a question for... I'll just speak. Question for Karen or for Pam. Adoption of innovation in the NHS. Do you have a prescription for the NHS?
I think I have to go now. What would you say?
I think one of the big challenges is if you have not developed your innovation with clinicians and clinician involvement and where relevant patient input, then you are fighting a losing battle in trying to get adoption at scale. But once you've got that endorsement, the worry about the evidence base, which they use often to say why they won't, disappears to a degree. It never goes away. And I think we've got, in the UK, we've got a number of organisations which are starting to mature in their ability to be able to encourage and support innovation more at scale. And some of the academic health science networks that, you know, the first 5 years, what do they really do? But suddenly they're starting to really be able to promote and get take-up. With the other thing we're seeing with more collaboration between organisations, and cost is is a big imperative to try and reduce the cost of care delivery ultimately, is collaboration and people being willing to now adopt things that were invented in the trust next door or the down the road or whatever. They're prepared to start to say, let's take best in breed and not try and start from scratch. And that is a changing mindset that we've seen happening. It's still not widespread, and they will always get the naysayers, but more and more. And I think because the tech is more intuitive to use and it doesn't require them to really understand how it works, but just know that it's been approved by the regulators, it's passed all the data protection checks, they feel confident using it and they will start to use it. And so I think we're just at a tipping point, but it is changing.
Very helpful, thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question. One more. Got the microphone? Have a microphone. I know I do it all. Sounds like it is.
Hi, my name is Anke Richter. I have a finance background. In medical products, mostly the beneficiary doesn't pay for it because the patient will not pay for it. So to which extent people who have new ideas spend on lobbying and trying to find a way either into the insurance companies or in the NHS? And is there also certain fields which will always find interest, maybe cancer, but then there are other areas, diseases where there's very little interest, or how does it work?
That's the selection process.
So it varies. So I don't know about you because I'm not involved so much in your sort of this sort of deep tech that we just heard about, but a lot of companies they think there's a logic. Connects to the last question. There's logic. This system works. This tech works. So the NHS will adopt it. It's got evidence. It will be more effective, less costly, and that doesn't necessarily work. So there is a lot of lobbying. And there are various bits of the National Health Service. In this country, you have to lobby from these buying groups called CCGs, they're called, to the top of the system as well. And I think some companies think it used to be walking into number 10 Downing Street because there's a very good health advisor there, and they go, oh, tick, that's it, tick. I've now got the NHS, sorted. And it doesn't work like that. If you've sold to one hospital, you've sold to one hospital in some cases, and you have to sort of wear out the shoe leather in a way to visit the various systems. But there is quite a lot of lobbying. There's also lobbying, sounds pejorative, doesn't it? There's a lot of work you have to do with the insurers in this country. And where are you from?
Germany.
Germany, yeah. It would be a lot of work with the different insurance companies or the social insurance companies there. But it's a sort of multifaceted approach, but you have to have evidence that your new thing works and that it might hopefully increase the efficacy of care for patients and save money. But it takes a long time. It links to the previous question.
Yeah, my experience on this is that two things. One is, yes, there are some some fields of medicine that that are easier in terms of getting money, at least for grants. So diabetes is one, it's been mentioned, cancer is another one. So if you target small diseases, it will be much harder to get interest from CCGs or from like GP practices or from grants. So yes, that's part of it. And then at least when I was in lots of incubators and medtech startups and so on, the tendency was do not even try the NHS, because even if you manage to collect the clinical evidence and you tick all the health economist report done, clinical trial done, I've done all the tick, it's clearly not a direct road to adoption. It will just make you go to the next step of the discussions, but it's still not going to be done. So the tendency was start with private world, go in Ireland, it's private medicine, healthcare, or go in anywhere where it's private, the US is a big market. And once you've secured revenue, then you can try to tackle the NHS, because then you will have revenue, so you will be more stable. And then you will have more time, and you will have clinical evidence. So it's kind of the tendency, at least from what I've seen when I was more involved with lots of different startups, was starting with the NHS, is really hard. For bioinduction, it's slightly different now because it's there are tenders. It's quite a standard process for medical devices. It's not like if we were trying to completely change the way healthcare is delivered. So if you want to change the healthcare model, find a new business model, that's going to take a long time.
Just quickly, in America, there's a once you go through regulation, there's a reimbursement system, so that there's massive lobbying in Washington, D.C. to get your thing with a code that gets reimbursed through Medicare, and then other people follow Medicare, but that's not the case here. No.
I just wanted to say, from that, you asked about the consumer, and the consumers won't buy some of these devices. Well, it's actually quite different. Consumers will buy something if they think it will help them manage their own health better, and often through patient groups where they have patients with similar diagnosis. They're on their patient group platform, and so they will go to their clinicians asking for particular technologies that will help them, or will just go and buy it for themselves if they can afford it. And some of these things aren't that expensive. And we heard about this today about a toothbrush that's going to be able to detect whether you've got oral cancer and things like that. If you thought that using your toothbrush could actually prevent you getting these diseases that are very difficult to detect, you might actually think, I'll pay another £50 for that toothbrush. You might decide you don't want to know, but it's your choice. And I think that consumerism of healthcare is driving a lot of the adoption, and it particularly links to the apps, where they are deciding which apps they're going to use. There might be loads out there, but they don't download half of them. And so people like the Health App Library, and there's the European App Library, that rank and rate apps out there and how beneficial they are to people with different diseases. That is helping spread that message and take up.
Good. I think I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a day at this stage. Sorry, I know there's one last question, but come and ask it to the panel afterwards. I think what I'm getting out of this is that there are a huge number of different things going on in medical technology. When I first started the work on this about 2 or 3 months ago, I was just sort of bowled over and thought to myself, "God, this is too wide a subject really for us." And there are lots and lots of things we haven't touched on at all tonight. Robotics and surgery and so on. Really very, very little have we spoken about those. All absolutely fascinating. So I think the first thing I would say is we'll probably have another one of these at some stage. The second thing I would say is that this does seem to me like a sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom and see what happens type scenario. Whether that will change and it will become a little bit more targeted as we begin to understand what these technologies can do for us, I don't know. But again, subject for another discussion. So I'd just like to thank our speakers hugely for coming on a really cold night and talking to us about really, really interesting things that interest us all from a personal point of view and from a social point of view. So thank you very much for that.